Coming up on the Tall Mike Wine Podcast.
I like to say, do you know anybody with a time machine? You could go back to 2012 and really enjoy those wines. She was the first person to pop up and she said, "This smells like chocolate."
You know, you're all just a bunch of snobby assholes, and I'm not going to drink your wine.
Yeah, snobby asshole. Those people are out there.
Wait a second. So this is just some guy who started a blog and tasted a bunch of wines, and now he's writing in Seattle Metropolitan? I could have done that. I wanted to respond to him and say, I did.
Sucker.
And now, the Tall Mike Wine Podcast.
The cell phones have been silenced. The wine is poured. I'll tell you all about the wine in due time. Just wait. And just like that, the podcast begins. The Tall Mike Wine Podcast, the wine podcast that's not all about wine. The wine podcast like no other. And currently number 13 on the FeedSpot list of the best wine podcasts. I'm Tall Mike Wine, your host for the Wine Podcast, heard in 57 countries, on 6 continents, and in 47 of these United States and the District of Columbia. From Brooklyn, New York to Milton, Freewater, Oregon. From Simpsonville, South Carolina to Lubbock, Texas. Yes, Lubbock, birthplace of not only Buddy Holly, but also Mac Davis, singer, songwriter, actor, underrated guy. A fun fact, he wrote a few hits for Elvis Presley. But I digress. Regardless of where you are listening, I thank you for finding my podcast. Now, help me out with a little love in the form of a rating. 5 stars, please. And review on Apple Podcasts. And subscribe on whatever app you're listening on so you don't miss an episode. They tell me all of these things help a lot. Now on with episode 38. Coming to you from my home studio in Novato, California. My guest is chatting with us via Zoom from the Pacific Northwest. He is the founder and editor of Northwest Wine Report. He's a regular contributor to Hugh Johnson's Pocket Wine Book and Seattle Met Magazine, and he also spent a number of years contributing to Wine Enthusiast, covering Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Canada. Since 2004, he's written over 400 magazine articles, 1,900 blog posts, and reviewed more than 16,000 Northwest wines. Now those are some numbers. My guest is Sean P. Sullivan. Hi, Sean.
Hi, Mike. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for giving me all those numbers. I love knowing you've reviewed 16,000 wines. And you just keep going, right?
Keep going. Yeah, the number's probably even higher than that because that's only counting starting in 2007. And I actually started reviewing wine back in 2004. Those reviews aren't entered into my database. So it's a big number. It's been a long time.
And you're in Seattle today. You live in Seattle.
Correct.
How much time do you spend east of the mountains where the grapes grow?
I try to get there as often as I can. With the pandemic that's cut down on that the last few years. Hopefully this year will look bit more like a regular year. So like an area like Walla Valley, one of Washington's major wine regions, I would typically get there 4 to 5 times a year under normal circumstances. So
how long of a drive to Walla for you?
It's about 4.5 hour drive or an hour plane ride. I've done both. So Walla, for those who haven't been there, it's a town of about 30,000 people, and there's 120 wineries and tasting rooms in the town. So very small, beautiful location, beautiful downtown. Yeah, well worth a visit, a wonderful place. And for me, always, there's the wineries there, but there's the vineyards there, there's the Blue Mountains. So it's always a rejuvenating experience to...
I feel like you really get away when you go to Walla. I've gone there every November for the last 3 years in a row, and I drive up from here. I stay a night in Bend, Oregon, and then I drive through to Walla. And just the scenery from Bend all the way to Walla is worth the price of admission.
It is.
Me.
Yeah, no, I agree with it. It's absolutely beautiful. I always say it's kind of like the song America the Beautiful. You've got the rolling waves of wheat. You've got the Blue Mountains, the purple majesties in the background, an incredible wine industry there. And
it's growing and growing and growing.
Yeah, it's amazing. So I started Originally, my site was called the Washington Wine Report, and I started that back in 2004. And back then, I used to go to Walla Walla a few times a year, and I would go to 5 new wineries each time that I would go out there, and I was falling behind. There were so many new wineries opening up.
I don't even know if I can wrap my brain around Walla Walla, just because there's so much going on and so much is changing so fast.
I agree with you. It's part of the excitement there is there's always new construction going on in terms of winery buildings. People are playing a little musical chair tasting rooms downtown, kind of moving around to different storefronts. There's new wineries opening up there, new vineyards being planted, new areas of the valley being explored. It's just it's a very vibrant wine region.
Let me just confess right now, one of the highlights of my weekend is when I'm scrolling through Facebook and I come across Sean's post. Hey, it's Friday night. What's everyone drinking? And I love to see what everyone's drinking. They post pictures, and I post a picture if I've got anything interesting, and I love to share a picture. Do you look at all the posts? Does anything ever surprise you in a big way?
Yeah, it's a fun way to kind of see what people have in their glass and what they're thinking about. Someone said to me once that social media is like the best eavesdropping that was ever invented, where you can find out, like, all right, the people who are paying attention to their page, what are they drinking and what are they kind of interested in? Not just what are they drinking, what are people liking that other people are posting? So for me, it's both interesting to see both the regional wines that people are drinking as well as national and international wines that people are drinking. I think the thing that I'm most surprised about when I look at people's responses, and I do look at them, is that a lot of people are drinking wines very, very young. This shouldn't be surprising to someone in the industry where we know that most people are buying wine and then opening that bottle, later that day or that evening.
I see that the average American consumer ages their wine in the car on the way home from the grocery store.
That is correct. And so that on some level, but to actually see people opening up, so for example, current vintages from Washington specifically for red wines would probably be 19s or maybe 20s, and you'll see people, their wine club wines will be released, or maybe they'll go to a release party that weekend and they'll come home and they'll pop that bottle right then, which I 100% understand and get. But obviously, some of the enjoyment of wine comes from aging it for some period of time as well, and not a lot of people necessarily have room, space, or money to have very large wine cellars. It's always surprising the youth of the wines that people are drinking.
How many comments do you typically get on a post like that with pictures of people's bottles?
It really varies from weekend to weekend, anywhere from maybe 35 to 70 or something like that. It's a fun way to build some community, hear about wines, and also for me, I can find out about wineries that way, right? Where people will say, hey, here's this new wine, and I'll say, hey, I'm not familiar with that wine. Do you like it? They'll say, I think it's really good. I'll do some research and maybe I'll reach out to the winemaker.
It's a fun way to find out about things you don't know about.
Yes.
Before we wrap up today, I want to get your address so I can mail you some of my official Tall Mike Wine podcast coasters. I wish you had a coaster to have under your glass while we're talking today.
I love it.
But I'll send you a stack of them, and anybody listening right now can get a stack of them by emailing me at tallmikewine@gmail.com. But we have come to the point in the program where I ask my guest, Sean, what's in your glass?
This is a 2020. The winery is called Pášxa. It's Paṣxa. Syrah, Walla Walla Valley. It comes from Rockgarden Vineyard, and I'll talk a little bit about the Rocks area. So we were talking earlier about Walla Walla Valley. The Rocks district is a sub-appellation. It's an ancient riverbed that was coming down. So the Walla Walla River from the Blue Mountains as this kind of gushing river with these kind of fist-sized basalt cobblestones. And we all know as rivers fan out, speed of the river slows down and the rocks kind of settle out. In this section of the valley, this giant river used to gush through, and The river's still going through there, but it's both taking a different course and it's much smaller than it used to be. But what it's left in its place is this ancestral riverbed. So going back to 1997, Christophe Barone at Cayuse Vineyards, Frenchman, was told by a friend about the rocks, or as he calls them, the stones in this region, and decided to plant a vineyard there. Subsequently was responsible for establishing one of the most unique and highest quality wine regions in certainly the US, if not the world overall, where you have these cobblestones that can go down 50 plus feet deep, and they're planting vines using crowbars, in his case, to kind of jimmy the vines in to get them established, and creates these wines that have a very distinctive character to them with a lot of savory components. So olive, smoked meat, soot, flour are all fairly common.
Hold up the bottle for me so I can get a picture. I know a little bit about that wine because I have a good friend who, when I first met her, was working at the Walls Winery, and that's a label put out by the Walls. And this is my friend Cara Almberg, who worked at the Walls. And Todd Alexander's the winemaker, and he started making the Pášxa wines. And he's also the winemaker at Force Majeure, where my friend Cara now works. I had her on the show like 2 episodes ago.
As you said, Todd Alexander, winemaker, both here, Force Majeure, the Walls, and also he's got an Oregon label called Holocene as well, where he does Pinot Noir. Very talented winemaker, working with some great fruit sources here.
What's the varietal there?
So this is Syrah.
That's the Syrah.
Yeah,
I've had the Pášxa Grenache. So how do you like that wine?
Oh, it's beautiful. It's got that kind of classic Rocks District profile of very savory aromas, a lot of black and green olive flower, that kind of soot.
I like to refer to that as the funk.
Mm-hmm. And then again, this very silky feel. One of the things I think that separates Todd Alexander and some other winemakers in that area is there's just incredible length at the end of the wine, both very precise aromas and flavors and impressive longevity.
2020 Pášxa. The way that it is spelled is odd. I think it has something to do with the Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest. And I will put I'll put the note in the show notes. So if you look at your app, you can actually read the name of the wine. And I took some nice pictures, so you can look on Instagram and see those. Let's get down to brass tacks now. Find out how this all started for you. According to your bio, you grew up in Massachusetts. Was that Boston or Western Mass? Dial it in.
Yeah, it was just a little outside of the Boston area, about 20 miles southeast of Boston. So kind of a hamlet suburb. We were on the train line that went into.
I had some Bostonians in the winery, and sometimes at the winery I'm sort of known to be irreverent, and I think that it's because I'm trying to entertain my coworkers with the things I say to guests, things that they would never say themselves. And these people came in and they said they were from Boston. And I said, I've always wondered something about Boston. And they're like, what is it? I said, at what age do they teach the kids to park the car? And I got a good laugh. So who was in the house when you were growing up? Do you have brothers and sisters? What were your parents up to?
Yeah, so I've got 3 older brothers, and I'm the youngest. Then my mom and dad, they split up when I was pretty young, about 4. Growing up, and generally spent summers with my dad.
And what kind of work did they do?
So my mom at that time, she was working at Head Start. So that's a program that kind of brings education and services to low income people. So she was a director in Brockton, Massachusetts. And my dad was an assistant dean of faculty at Southeastern Massachusetts University, or what is now University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, which if you ever get the chance to go there, has a very fun kind of space age campus to it that was a great place to run around as a kid.
So there were educated people in your house.
Yeah, definitely. And we didn't necessarily have a lot of wine around. I remember, we had the kind of classic Chianti bottle with the melted wax candles in it, and the, nice basket at the bottom people had. And my mom would have wine with dinner occasionally, and I would try the wine or I would try the coffee. My grandmother, who also helped raise it, my mom's mom, would let me try her coffee, which of course both the coffee and the wine didn't taste particularly appealing to me.
Just way too much flavor for a child's delicate palate.
Yeah, a little bit too much for me. It really wasn't until much later on that I got interested in wine.
Also from your bio, you came out to Washington to pursue a love of mountain climbing. Did you see yourself as some sort of modern-day Jeremiah Johnson? This is a reference that's going to be lost on 75% of the audience. When did that love first spark for you, and what was it about Washington? Shout out to Mount Rainier. Specifically Washington that made it the one for you. Why not Utah? Why not Colorado? Why not Alaska?
Yeah, so it really actually was Mount Rainier for me. So my brother, who's closest in age, he's about a year and a half older than I am. He went to college at Evergreen State University.
That says a lot about him.
Yes, and in Olympia, Washington. And so when I graduated, I guess a year earlier than he did, when I graduated, I came out here that summer. That was the summer in 91. And lived out here for that summer with him, and just really fell in love with Seattle. I mean, anyone who's come to Seattle during the summertime, it is just an incredibly beautiful, sunny, sparkling place. That's the reason they call it the Emerald City. And then, of course, what they don't tell you is, 9 months out of the year is it's gray. And
here comes the clouds and the mist.
I came out here, and my brother and I went to Mount Rainier, and I was just absolutely captivated by it. For people who haven't been out here, so 14,411 foot volcano that sits about 100 miles away from downtown Seattle, and looks like it's kind of floating above the clouds. So I started out and got very interested in hiking and backpacking, and then went back to the East Coast for a stretch, came back to Seattle 96, 97, and kind of got it in my head that I was going to try to climb Mount Rainier.
Okay.
And I was very mesmerized by that mountain.
It really cast a spell on you, it sounds like.
It cast a spell on me, and I somewhat foolishly decided I was going to try to climb it. I spent a good chunk of time when I was living in Boston at this point trying to prepare myself. So I would train in my apartment, and I would put a backpack on of 20, 30 pounds. So then I did that, and then I came out, I think it was August of 95, and ended up climbing the mountain. And that was my introduction to mountain climbing, and it was by far the biggest ass kicker that I've ever experienced in my life.
But you summited the first attempt, right?
I did, yeah. I had trained really hard for it, but I was probably using a 30-pound pack. We were probably carrying 45. You're also, as you get up in elevation, the air gets a lot thinner. I wasn't all prepared for that. And then the real kicker was you need to wear technical mountaineering boots, because you're wearing crampons and steel spikes on the bottom of your shoes. And so I rented some, and the size I rented was just a little too small, as anyone can attest who's worn a pair of shoes that's too small on climb a 14,000 foot mountain. That was very painful. And when I came back down from the summit, there's a base camp where you start. I remember I pulled my boot off, and there was just blood all around my toes. And
that's total Jeremiah Johnson right there, man. Yes. That's some tough guy stuff.
It was incredibly physically demanding, but there's really no other experience like that, where you start out at night because you don't want the snow to melt, and also there's increased rockfall danger as it warms up. So you start out at night, and then the sun comes up, and you're above the clouds. You've just got the summit of Mount Rainier and the other tall peaks in Washington poking up above the clouds, and it's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen in your life. So,
and this is the moment you decided you were going to move to the Northwest, or was that? Yeah, did that come later?
I mean, I had really, when I came out here in 91, I fell in love with the area, and I wanted to live out here. I was always trying to figure out a way to get myself out here and to stay out here for good since I came out here in 91, but I didn't finally manage to make that final jump until the fall of 2000, when I came out here for good, and have been here ever since.
You came out here under the spell of Mount Rainier, and you got into the mountain climbing community, and little did you know you were going to meet up with something else that would take you under its spell in a few years, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But first, it's time to talk about what's in Mike's glass today, and I gave this a lot of thought. I talk about a lot of Northwest wines because I'm from the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in Bremerton, Washington, always looking at Mount Rainier, but it never cast its spell on me. So I decided to taste a wine that was not from Washington, not from the United States at all. I have an Italian wine in my glass. This is a wine called Montevetrano, and all you have to do is look at that label and be like, which one of their wines is it? Well, it's the only wine that they make. Montevetrano. This is the Montevetrano from Campania, which is the area in the southeastern coast of Italy near the town of Naples. It's a great small production wine. So this is the 2010 Montevetrano. The property was purchased in the 1940s by the family that still farms it, and they were making a little bit of wine for themselves back then. It wasn't until 1991 the family first produced its bottles of actual, like, we made this wine. They have 12 acres, and that's it. 2,500 cases of wine. Campania is interesting because it's not a very big, it's the 9th largest wine producing region in Italy. So it's not, one of the big ones. It's not Chianti. It's not any of the other, Piemonte, any of those ones you've ever heard of. The mix here is something that you will be familiar with because it's a very Northwest sounding blend. This is 40% Cabernet, 30% Aglianico, which is the local native grape, and 20% Merlot. So if this was a little further north up in Tuscany, this would be considered a super Tuscan. But here it's just, it's a blend they make because they planted these grapes and it's the only one that they make, which I think is kind of cool. The wine itself, Robert Parker gave it 96 points. Wine Enthusiast gave it 92 points. It's very, very, very silky. For a wine that has this much Cabernet in it, it's very, very, very silky and smooth. And I think that's part of that is because it's from 2010. So this one's been in the cellar for a while. And the Wine Spectator gave it 91 points. And you know how the Wine Spectator always gives you that drinking window? I think they kind of nailed it with this one because it says best from 2015 through 2022. And as I was sipping this, I thought, yeah, I think maybe I should have checked in with this 2 or 3 years ago. It's delicious. Everything is really, really smooth and amazing. It's just not as feisty as I would hope for a wine that had this much cab in it. It's really good, but I wish it had a little bit more volume to it as far as the flavors go. It's all integrated. It's wonderful, but it's just a little bit too soft for me. And this is something I tell people at the winery. I say, you can age your wine and it's going to get nice and soft and delicious. The flavors will integrate. But if you wait too long and it becomes too soft, you start to lose the volume of flavor. And I think this wine is just it's starting to get a little tired. So I'm glad I drank this bottle now and didn't wait any longer.
I've had a friend who in the past said, I bought these wines from the grocery store and I've been storing them up on top of my fridge for the last 10 years. Oh, no. And I'm wondering when I should open them. I have to be the bad guy to say, like, unfortunately, these wines were never meant to be aged.
One,
very, very inexpensive wines that you bought at the grocery store.
Right.
And number two, you should never store your wines on top of your fridge. One, because it's warm, and two, because your fridge is vibrating on a pretty regular basis, which both will prematurely age your wine. So
and the lights in the refrigerator, the lights in the kitchen are typically brighter lights too.
Yeah, brighter lights in there and a generally warm area. So he had some wonderful vinegar that he had been
finely aged vinegar, artisanal.
Yeah. A friend of mine, Paul Greggett, who's also a writer here in the Northwest, he always says better to drink a wine a year too early than a day too late.
I like that.
Yeah, it's very true, right? As I stated earlier, it can be very enjoyable to age wine, but wine also has a somewhat finite span as well. And
there is a thing out there, though. It's a misconception. And since I'm in contact with wine consumers on a daily basis, so wine consumers of varying knowledge levels, I don't know if people get this from movies or what it is, but they think, the older, the better. And I'll have people call me at the winery and say, oh, we were there in 2010 and we have these Pinots from 2006. We purchased them. When should we drink them? And I like to say, do you know anybody with a time machine? Because you could go back to 2012 and really enjoy those wines. I think now you should definitely open them and drink them if you can, but you probably will find them fairly undrinkable. It's not like they turn to vinegar. They just get really soft. And the flavors get a little weird because everything's sort of aged. And as you get older, the wines get older, all the flavors start to go in this, for a while they're in harmony. And then after a while, some of them are dying. So the other ones are like, well, that flavor died. Let's go off in our own direction. And pretty soon you get these wines that are just really odd tasting. I guess that's the best way I can put it. Odd tasting.
And I would also say even wine that is well aged and is meant to be aged. So by well aged, I mean is put in a good environment to age with temperature control and humidity control, what have you, is going to taste very different than new release, young, fruity, vibrant wine is going to taste. That can be something of an acquired taste, right? Especially a lot of consumers are used to tasting wines right when they come out, when they're very youthful and very fruit forward. And then as you said, over time, the profile of those wines change quite a bit. And some people might like the way they've changed, and some people might not, even if the wine is a high quality wine that's aged very well. It might just not be for their palate. Right.
And I referenced that Wine Spectator a drinking window, and I think that's they usually come down on a pretty legitimate side of that whole issue. But the thing is, it's all very much personal preference. People ask me, how long should we age the wines? And I say to them, this is like you and I go to the steakhouse and you ask me how you should have your steak cooked, because that's a very personal decision. I might say, get it, medium rare, get it a little on the raw side. And you're going to be like, oh, I don't like it that way. Well, it's because we're different people.
And to extend that analogy a little bit further, you might say, well, this particular restaurant that I go to here, I like to get it medium rare. This particular restaurant over here, a different steak, different preparation, I like to get it medium well.
Exactly.
There's going to be a lot of variation.
That's a great extension of the analogy. I like that. Thank you.
And it's hard to explain that. Consumers they want me to say, Mike, you should drink this between now and 2028. Not a day before and not a day after. And you'll see you reference the Spectator drinking window. Different magazines and different critics will sometimes have very different perceptions, just based on how they like to drink. So it's, as you say, very much a personal palate thing and kind of how you like to drink and enjoy your wines.
Since you've written tasting notes on a few thousand wines, let's talk about that process. Working in a winery myself, being in contact with wine consumers daily, that's one of the somewhat mystical things about the wine world in the eyes of a lot of people, i.e., how do we do that thing where we come up with the different flavors? We talk about vanilla, you were talking about the Rocks District, and Walla is saying, you have these flavors of like seared meat and things like that. And most people will look at you and be like, really? Your wine tastes like meat? Okay, what's wrong with you, dude? So if you can, walk me through your process when you're going to write a note on a specific wine. Where do you start? How do you move through it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing that I would say as a kind of prelude to that is that, so I'm writing for my own site now, Washington Wine Report. Prior to this, I was a contributing editor, as you mentioned, at Wine Enthusiast Magazine, 9.5 years. And in both cases, I'm tasting wines in a blind environment. And what that means is I don't know what the producer or the cost or appellation or what have you. I do know the variety. So variety is the only thing that I'm sorting on. It might be, say, Cabernet Sauvignon, Bordeaux style blends, Syrah, or what have you. So I'm lining up a series of bags. Typically, I'm tasting about 8 wines a day, most days during the week. Then just popping and pouring them and swirling the glass and trying to get some aromatic impression. I think for anyone who starts out doing this, it can be difficult. What I did and what I would encourage people starting out to do is you can use an aroma wheel. There's a variety of ones that have been produced that basically start out from wider aroma groups or flavor groups into more and more specific ones. saying like, this is fruit. Is it red fruit or is it black fruit? Well, it's red fruit. Well, it's like, hey, is there a raspberry red fruit, or is it a red cherry? Is it something else going on there? Sometimes you can say that like, oh, this smells exactly like raspberries, or even a certain type of raspberry maybe. And sometimes you're like, it's more red fruit. It's not necessarily as well delineated as you might expect elsewhere. Getting some sense of the aromas, and also what are the aromas like? Or is it a very aromatic wine where you're getting this big pop of expression, or is it something where you're kind of swirling your glass and thinking like, well, what is that exactly? And trying to convey that experience a bit to people. And then taking a sip of the wine, getting a sense of what's the feel and overall impression. What are the flavors that you get? What are the tannins like? Are they firm? Are they soft? Are they dry? Are they angular? And then kind of a number of other factors. So when I'm doing this, I've got my computer next to me and typing in a bunch of kind of impression notes. Then it's a matter of trying to put that together into a kind of sentence form tasting note that reads in some way that hopefully both conveys a sense of what this particular wine is like and what consumers might expect if they're getting it. A good example would be a Chardonnay, where I can say, I try stainless steel Chardonnay, and it's very light on the impressions of the aromas, maybe with some apples, maybe with a little pear. There's no kind of oak influence. The oak, you kind of get some spicing or potentially some toasting. And it's going to be probably a pretty crisp impression on the palate, and generally not always somewhat lower in alcohol. That style can vary. You compare that to a fully oaked, maybe fully ML'd Chardonnay, where you might say, this is a butter bomb, right? Where it's like, it has this real buttery impression to it. You get a lot of that oak spicing. And of course, there's some rating attachment that goes to it. I think it's hard for anyone starting out to do, but for me, the way that I really got into doing this was going around and to area tastings and trying a lot of wines and just writing down my thoughts about them and trying to put what you think into words, even if it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to you, and then trying to get more formalized.
Yeah, it's just exercising a muscle.
Yes.
I tell people, I say, you just have to start thinking along the lines of, what am I tasting? What am I smelling? You just have to really focus on it. You know, if you start to focus on it, and like you said, use some prompts, use the flavor wheel. Or there's a series of prompts you can use, okay, we're going to start with the fruit, and then we're going to look for something earthy, and then we're going to look for something wood-based, and then we're going to add maybe floral. And if you isolate the different things, it's a little bit easier, but you just have to really focus. You have to clear out all the noise from your world. And I'm sure you sit at home in a quiet room and do all of your tastings.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. It's very much a matter of practice. That said, obviously some folks are better at it than others. I had a roommate a number of years ago now who I remember pouring this wine for her and saying, like, what do you think? And she was like, there's blueberries and there's a little bit of orange there. And there's some herb thing there too. And I was like, wow, like, you're absolutely right. She has no real background in wine whatsoever, had both a keen sense of smell and a keen ability to put it into words.
Sometimes it's fun to taste wine with people who claim to not know anything about tasting wine. I was teaching a class, a restaurant staff, years ago here in the Bay Area, and I had a new server on staff, and she said, I don't want to come to your class. And I'm like, why? And she said, well, I don't want to have to do that thing where you say, oh, it's cherry, it's this, it's that, because I can't do that. I said, okay, well, you can come to the class and you don't have to say a word. So it was a class on big reds. So we had, the Cabs and the Merlots, and the first wine I poured was some big oaky Cab. And I said, okay, I'm going to pour this around, and you guys want to just start letting me know what you're smelling. And this young lady who said she didn't want to say a word, she was the first person to pop up, and she said, this smells like chocolate. And I'm like, congratulations. You just nailed this wine.
Yeah, I think the thing about wine that I am always cognizant of is that it's very, very intimidating to people.
Yeah.
And you get people are reluctant to say, if you say, Mike, what do you smell? And you say something and I'm like, you're wrong.
Right.
Those aromas aren't on this wine. That's a terrible,
Yes.
terrible answer. If you go to the movies and I say, what did you think of this new Top Gun movie that was out? And you say, like, well, I thought it was really interesting, and it was an interesting callback to the original one and wonderful special effects and what have you. And I say, actually, you're wrong. It was a terrible movie, and the script was bad, the acting was worse, and it was terrible. And you think, you know what? Now I agree with you. Now that you say that, even I liked the movie and I had a great time, but now that you tell me I shouldn't have, that it was bad, I enjoy that movie a lot less. That doesn't happen, right? You would argue with me about it, and we would have this discussion back and forth. And yet somehow with wine, we have this thing where it's a very intimidating subject to people. So you can make people feel like their impressions are not necessarily good. I always say to folks, I can't tell you if you'll enjoy the wine or not. I can tell you if it is a high quality wine or not. And maybe you will or won't like it based on the style or based on your personal palate. It's something I think a lot about with wine, and certainly with trying to figure out how do we get younger generations of people interested in wine in a subject that has been singularly intimidating, that a lot of us have overcome that intimidation. But I think a lot of younger people might think, you're all just a bunch of snobby assholes, and I'm not going to drink your wine.
Yeah, snobby assholes, exactly.
And so
those people are out there.
What do we do with that as an industry, right? And they're not necessarily wrong.
Nope, not at all.
Right? So how do we adapt and change that? Because wine is singularly intimidating to people. I've racked my brain trying to think, is there anything else where we could have that kind of conversation?
I think that an easy way to sum up this whole thing is there seem to be a lot more gatekeepers involved in wine and enjoying wine. Say you go to a restaurant and there's this big wine list put together by the sommelier, and that word by itself just makes me think, well, who the fuck is that he calls himself a sommelier? I used to work in restaurants, and I'd come to the table and they'd say, "Are you the sommelier?" And I'd say, "Is that a French word for tall, bald man? Because that's what I am." Just to kind of put them at ease. I have no special title. I never went to school. I've never been in a wine class. I've taught wine classes, but I've never been in a wine class. I just want to keep it fun and keep it light. But in the world of wine, there are multiple, for lack of a better word, gatekeepers that are like, you can't taste this wine. You haven't earned the right.
You and I know the reasons for this, right? But even there, we're at a restaurant and our server comes up, they inquire about the wine, they give us the list, and then they say, "Oh, I'm going to step away because I don't know anything about wine." So we're going to call over the person who does know something about wine. And a guy comes over with a suit. He's got a little pin on there. And it's like, now you're feeling intimidated, right? It's like your server who you're interacting with, they're not qualified to talk about it. So now you're talking with someone who surely is qualified and has the attire and the pin to prove it. And that's very, very intimidating.
That's the thing about wine that's so different than a lot of other things.
It's very, very intimidating to people. I understand why a lot of that is, but I also think a lot about how to try and change that.
All right. When we left off with your life story, it was the turn of the century, and you had moved to Seattle to pursue a love of Mount Rainier and all things outdoors and mountainish. And then at some point, and this is what I want to know, you tasted some wine, and it started to get you excited about wine, and specifically Washington wine. So when did that happen? And can you remember if there was a specific wine?
When I came out here in 2000, I was kind of doing like a hard life reboot. What I said is, all right, I'm going to throw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall, and as a way to both try to meet people, as a way to explore new interests, as a way to try to understand the new region that I was living in. As I said, I started taking the Seattle Mountaineers basic climbing class. I also joined the Sierra Club's Inner City Outings program. I was a salmon steward, which is basically someone who educates people about salmon at a local park. I went to a current...
Wait a minute. You were salmon steward Scott Sullivan or Sean Sullivan?
I was indeed a
That's
salmon.
a lot of alliteration there. I really like that.
And I went to a local bookstore, Elliott Bay. They had a current issues book club that did a monthly book club. I did that. I probably did a host of other things that I forgot. One of the things that I decided to do was take an introduction to wines of the world at South Seattle Community College. At that time, I really knew much and nothing about wine. I was just kind of interested in it and got very interested in learning more about it. So I thought to myself, all right, how am I going to start doing this? Bordeaux is a great wine region. I'll learn everything I can about Bordeaux. Quickly found out, like, all right, that's a pretty deep end of the pool to dive into. So at that time, there were less than 200 wineries in Washington. And I said, okay, I'm interested in learning about wine. There's less than 200 wineries in Washington. I just moved to this state. I can learn about wine and learn about this state. I could try wines from maybe every single one of these wineries. I might even be able to try every wine that's being produced in Washington.
Right, 200 wineries. That was back in the early days.
Yeah, and you know what? They make 3-4 wines a piece. Maybe we're talking a few hundred wines to try. Around this time, I was also I was going to all the local tastings in town. So all of the wine shops that poured weekly tasting events, I would go to every single one of them without fail. Again, was writing notes down as I was doing it. I was very interested in wine. As I think your listeners know, there's so much to understand and so much to learn. Ironically for me, I was drinking a lot of Washington wine from my local wine shop then. Like I remember having the Kiona Limburger, their Red Mountain Limburger, which was then and is still now a pretty inexpensive wine. That was one of the early wines that I had. I remember having the Jed Steele Pinot Noir from Willamette Valley. But interestingly, the wine that really was kind of an aha moment for me was a wine that I had at Seattle Wine Cellars. It was a shop that was downtown in Seattle. It's not there anymore. And they used to have these tastings. I think they were on Thursday night, and I used to go to that tasting. And then there was another one on the other side of town. They had 3 wines, and one of them, I don't remember what the first 2 were, honestly, but they had a wine that was, I think it was maybe $15, and then the second one was $25, and then the third one was $50, and that third one was the 1999 Duckhorn Merlot. I tried the 3 of those wines, and I was like, the qualitative difference between these wines is really super clear to me. And this third wine, which was, easily 3x more than any wine that I was purchasing at that time, was also really, really good and delicious. So I said to myself, I'm going to start a wine cellar. And I'm going to start a wine cellar with this bottle of wine. So I bought that bottle of Duckhorn Merlot. I took it home, and I was living just around the corner from where I live right now. My roommate came home, and I was like, you got to try this wine I just had. And we popped open the wine and we drank it right there on the porch that evening. It wasn't the beginning of my wine cellar, unfortunately.
I was just going to say, you bought that for the cellar and then you went home and opened it. Wait a minute, that's not how it works.
It didn't happen, but I was very interested in wine. And my original intent was just to learn all I could about Washington wines, try to taste as many wines as I could from the state, and then just move on to something else. It was right around this time in the early aughts that an enormous number of new wineries were opening up in Washington. So I mentioned going out to Walla Valley a few times a year and visiting 5 new wineries and falling behind when I was doing it. So I first went out to Walla in 2004, and there were just new wineries popping up left and right. Again, I was a big note taker just to try to get myself to think about the wines and also to try to remember my impressions with them. I'd also started writing down a very simple scoring system to remember what I liked more and what I liked a little bit less. Then what happened is a friend of mine and I, we went out to Yakima Valley visit a bunch of wineries together. He said to me after I didn't take any notes. Could you mind typing up your notes and sending them to me? And I said, sure. They were terse. I mean, my early tasting notes, they were very embarrassing to look back at. They were very, very terse. I typed up my terse notes and my rating systems for the wine, then I popped them into an email to him. He had some friends who said, oh, so you went to Yakima Valley. Where'd you go? What'd you taste? What did you like? And he said, well, I'll forward you along my friend's notes.
Wow.
And I was horrified that he did.
That was for you.
Yeah, that was very much for him. They were not anything that I was comfortable with being distributed. But what I found out was there was really interest in it because a lot of wineries were popping up and there wasn't great information out there.
Right.
So I started, this was 2004 again. So I started this originally friends and family style email list, just saying like, hey, here's a bunch of new wines that I tasted, and whether it was Woodinville or whether it was Walla or Yakima Valley or wherever, sent those around. And I put at the very top Washington Wine Report. It was pretty literal, right? It was a report on Washington wines.
It is what it is. It says what it is.
It is what it is. And it just kind of grew from there. Then I started making those into PDF files with pictures and information about wineries. So then in 2007, I moved the site into an online site, and it's kind of been there ever since as Washington Wine Report, and then rebranded it as Northwest Wine Report.
Back in the days when there was a new thing called blogs.
Exactly. Yeah. Like I said, my intent was to spend a quick minute tasting Washington wines and then move on to something else, but I just happened to do it at a time that the industry really exploded. So it was a right time and place for me.
That's a very inspiring story. You were the kind of person who wanted to take notes all the time. I think that's a special thing about you.
No doubt. If I were not a note taker, I would not be doing what I'm doing. I chuckle when I first started writing for Seattle Metropolitan Magazine. There was this comment from someone who said, wait a second, so this is just some guy who started a blog and tasted a bunch of wines and now he's writing in Seattle Metropolitan? I could have done that. And I wanted to respond to him and say, I did do that.
Sucker.
And the differences between you and me is you could have, but I actually went forward and did it. But yeah, what I did was, it was that simple.
He's just some guy. What's up with that? This is how that whole culture of gatekeepers is continued on, because people say wine is intimidating. There are all of these people that know so much stuff. And then somebody says, well, before we choose our wine, let's consult a guy who knows a lot of stuff.
Absolutely.
There's something wrong with that.
I can tell you, even today, I've been doing this now, it'll be 19 years next month. I'll still have people say to me, well, what are your credentials? Have you taken any of the WSET classes? And have you taken any of the sommelier certifications and whatever? And I'm not trying to necessarily poo-poo those things. I think they can be useful. And I think education about wine is a good thing, but it still is a little astounding to me that it's all right, at nearly moving towards 20 years in on this whole thing and having done a lot of writing and a lot of reviewing, you still want to see if I got a little pin on my lapel or not.
People still want to see your credentials. Okay. No, he's actually written reviews of 16,000 wines. That's a great story. I like that story a lot. Tell me, who are some under-the-radar wineries or wine people we can look forward to hearing about in the future? Now that you've gone from being a total novice guy who took notes and went to tastings, and now you're somebody, I'd love to have a scoop. What's percolating just under the radar right now in the Northwest that is going to be the next big deal? Maybe it's a winery, maybe it's a person, maybe it's a grape variety.
I would actually take it a little bit larger than that and say, so I'm really excited about what's happening in the Northwest right now. So we all know Oregon, generally speaking, but Willamette Valley much more specifically has been having a moment, right? The wines have been getting a lot of attention, a lot of praise, and deservedly so, a lot of external investment coming in, and that's been going on for a number of years now at a very fast clip. I think the beginning of the early 2000s in Washington saw this kind of, I call it the big boom of Washington wine, where we went from that less than 200 wineries into the, over time building up to the 1,100 we are today. But I think this is kind of a second major moment that we're seeing in the industry, where we've seen people like last year, Jackson family came in and purchased its first vineyard in Walla Valley.
Well, and your Duckhorn people came up and started shaking the bushes themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, Duckhorn came up in 2012 and started the Canvasback project, and they're making tens of thousands of cases of Red Mountain Cabernet and also Columbia Valley Cabernet and other varieties as well. A lot of big companies, but more are coming. I think it's a super exciting time in the Northwest in general. Washington is poised for a great moment. And then the kind of undiscovered country further north in BC, where we don't see a lot of those wines down here in the US, but there's some really good things happening up there as well. So
Okanagan Valley, shout out.
hoping to shine a light on that.
Do you have any questions for me, Sean?
So you've done a lot of podcasts at this point. What are some of the things you've learned and taken away from it?
You know what I've come to know is that it's not so much what people have to say and what they know about wine for my podcast. It's more like, how did it all happen for them? I find that is the most fascinating thing. And I'm still to the point where I'm just kind of reaching out to people who I know or kind of know, or like you. I know you from Facebook. I know you from, your blog. It's more like, it's fun to talk about the wines and talk about the regions and what we all know and share our knowledge. But I think at the end of the day, I am more fascinated with people's stories. Like, you grew up just outside of Boston and you came out to climb mountains in Washington, and then you just kind of cast a wide net to find interesting things to do in your new home, and you found wine, and now you have a blog that's been there, and it's a trusted by a lot of people resource for wine information. And I think the stories are my favorite thing now, really.
I always say, like, the clothes you wear, the car you drive, even sometimes the food you eat, you don't necessarily know anything about them. But in the wine world, you can, like, I can say, all right, I'm enjoying this wine, Pášxa wine made by Todd Alexander. I know Todd. I've known Todd ever since he moved up here from Napa Valley. I want to say it was 2015 or so, and enjoyed his wines and enjoyed getting to know him as a person and getting to know his wines through that as well. And that's something certainly for small wineries is a very unique opportunity to create a direct connection with a product.
For sure. Well, it's been lovely chatting with you.
Yes. Thank you.
Sean P. Sullivan is the editor-in-chief at the Northwest Wine Report. Is that a thing people can subscribe to, or they just have to go on the blog?
So, yeah, you can go to the site. You can sign up to receive articles via email. It's also going to be moving to semi-subscription based in the future, where wine reviews are going to be paywalled in the very near future. Most writing content will be free, so there'll be some subscription options coming up hopefully in about a month or so, if all goes well.
Oh, okay. Cool, man. Well, thanks for hanging out.
Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, my pleasure. Hang on, I'm going to read the credits, okay? The Tall Mike Wine Podcast was conceived and is written, produced, edited, and maintained by yours truly. For feedback, questions of any kind, suggestions, or for your very own set of Tall Mike Wine coasters, write to me at tallmikewine@gmail.com. See pictures of the wines I'm drinking, the food I'm eating, way too many pictures of Olive, my sweet little kitty cat. That's all on the Instagram at Tall Mike Wine. Follow me and use the hashtag #SexyBottleShot to show me what you're drinking. Oh, and I'll ask again because it's important. Ratings and reviews on Apple Podcast. Tell your friends about the podcast. Thanks so much, Sean P. Sullivan, for hanging out from my studio in Novato, California. I'm Mike Stone, a.k.a. Tall Mike Wine. Keep swirling, keep sniffing, keep sipping. Cheers.